Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, State Compliance with Real ID, an update from DHS. My name is Ben Hush, Senior Committee Director for NCSL's Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee, and I'll be your moderator today. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to review a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is the first in the NRI Committee's 2017 Spring Webinar Series. As part of the series, the committee will host a new webinar every other week, with our next webinar Thursday, May 4th, with a focus on state efforts to reduce food waste. For a complete schedule and registration details for those, please visit our website, www.ncsl.org. Our webinar today is being recorded, and all registrants will be able to access a recording of the webinar and presentation slides on NCSL's website. We will send out a notice shortly with a link to these resources, but in the meantime, you can download those slides being used today by clicking on the Media Library icon in the upper right portion of your screen. And of course, please feel free to submit a question at any time by typing into the chat box in the lower left-hand corner. We will hold a Q&A after our speaker finishes presenting. But back to why we are here today. I think the title really says it all, but in short, over the next 45 minutes or so, our speaker, and in particular your questions, will dig into how the Department of Homeland Security is preparing for full implementation of Real ID and the many issues impacting full compliance. With only 9 months or so remaining before residents from non-compliant states are unable to use their state-issued driver's license to board a commercial aircraft, the issue is quickly rising to the top. Here today to help us dive into the specifics of this issue is Steve Yonkers. Steve currently serves as the Director of Identity and Credentialing, including the Real ID program for the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Policy Screening Coordination Office. In this role, Steve leads the department's management of Real ID compliance and enforcement efforts in collaboration with federal, state, local, tribal, and NGO partners. Prior to working at the Screening Coordination Office, Steve served 10 years with DHS's U.S. Visit program. Steve has also served in leadership roles with both criminal justice, grant management, and immigration compliance inspection programs with the U.S. Department of Justice. Steve, thank you so much for joining us today, and with that, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Ben. And I just want to say thank you for this opportunity to brief the National Conference of State Legislators. So what I'd like to do today, I'm going to go to my first slide, is give you a little bit of an overview of the Real ID Act, talk about compliance and extensions, and then finish up with our phased enforcement schedule. So looking at slide 2 here, so you can see that the Real ID Act was actually born out of the 9/11 Commission recommendations. At that time, I think we'd established that 18 of the 19 hijackers had something like 30 different driver's licenses and IDs, and 2 of them were able to gain IDs and driver's licenses even though they were unlawfully present in the U.S. And so out of this came the 9/11 recommendations to essentially create a level of security for all driver's licenses and ID documents, and to ensure that the people who are issued these documents are the same people who should receive them and are the same people that are using them. Moving to the next slide. So what does the Real ID Act actually do? So it prohibits the federal agencies from accepting for official purposes driver's licenses and ID cards from non-compliant states. The purposes for which one must use a Real ID Act compliant license is accessing federal facilities, boarding regulated commercial aircraft, that's through TSA, entering nuclear power plants, and then the last part of the actual act says, and any other purpose that the Secretary of Homeland Security shall determine. Now, we always get questions about this last part. What do we mean, any other purpose? So there are no other purposes in the regulation. It's just those first 3. These 3 purposes have been unchanged for the last 9 years. We have no intent of making any additional changes, and even if we did, it would require going through the regulatory process to do that. So the Real ID Act, it establishes minimum standards for the secure issuance of state-issued driver's licenses and identification cards. And this is really based on pre-existing DMV best practices. It was really the practices of the DMVs from across the country that really created the foundation for the Act itself and then the implementing regulation. So in many ways, the Act requirements are things that DMVs were already doing and wanting to pursue. The Act covers all 56 jurisdictions, so that's not just the 50 states, that's also District of Columbia and 5 territories. Now, the Act authorizes DHS to issue regulations and set standards. It authorizes us to determine whether a state is meeting the minimum standards based on the certification submitted by the state. So essentially, the states provide us an informational update on where they are in meeting 43 different requirements, and based on that, we determine whether they should be granted an extension or hopefully granted compliance and then judged as a compliant state. So if you notice, it allows us to grant states extensions of time, and it's really about them providing adequate justification for noncompliance and what we call demonstrating sufficient progress, that they keep making the right steps forward, making progress, having milestones, things like that. And then finally, it authorized DHS to make grants to the states. So through FEMA, we granted $263 million in grants, and that was from fiscal year 2009 to fiscal year 2011. Now today, there's still grant money available. It's through the Homeland Security grants that are available to all of the states, but that's more of a block type grant. Can be used for many different things, and ultimately the state has to decide how they're going to use that funding, if they wish to use it for Real ID implementation or not. So the Real ID Act, what does it do, what does it not do? So it does require proof of identity and lawful status. So that means the individual must come to the DMV and present and have verified documents that show the person's legal name, their date of birth. Now they can do that through having a passport, or they can use a birth certificate for that purpose. They have to provide their Social Security number, and that actually means bringing in your Social Security card and presenting that. You have to provide documentation that shows that you have an address within the United States, and then you have to indicate that you have lawful status, and that's one of the checks that the DMV does. Now, the card itself also has to have certain security requirements embedded within it. So it must have the biographic information, digital photo, signature, card number, but it also must deploy physical and anti-counterfeit security features. So that way it's not easily cloned or just made by someone else. And then must also have what we call common machinery readable technology. That's your magnetic stripe, if you will. Now, the Real ID Act also requires safeguards for the actual issuance and production of licenses. So that's more on the processing side. So the DMV does have to copy and retain the source document information I mentioned above. Now, they can retain it by paper, in which case they have to retain it for 7 years, or they can retain it digitally, which means they would have to retain it for 10 years, and that's in the law. They must have secure production facilities and document materials. And finally, the DMV must conduct background checks and provide fraudulent document training for all of its employees. Now, what does the Real ID Act not do? So first and foremost, it does not create a national ID card. It also does not create any type of federal database of driver information. In fact, there is no new federal access to state driver information or the Real ID information through this act. It also does not authorize DHS in any way to regulate the issuance of driver's licenses or identification cards issued by the states. As well as to say, state participation is voluntary. It's really, the law is really a mandate on the federal government. It's a mandate on what we can accept for official purposes for access. But of course, there are consequences for not meeting the standards. Now, the Act does not prevent any state from issuing non-compliant driver's licenses or identification cards in addition to a Real ID card. Now, if they do decide to issue a non-compliant card, there are some requirements that the card incorporate a unique design, meaning that it physically looks different from the Real ID card. And also, they must indicate on the card itself that it cannot be accepted for official purposes. Now, there's a few reasons for why states might want to do this. One, it gives them the opportunity to provide a convenience to the residents. If the resident does not need to be accessing federal facilities, does not need to board airplanes, may have another alternative document like a passport, then they can often go through a simpler process of getting a non-compliant card. It could also be cheaper for the DMVs. So instead of having to bring everyone back to the DMV to reissue what we call recredential its residents with Real ID Act compliant cards, they wouldn't have to do that. It'd be a much smaller population doing that. And currently we have 21 states that are issuing both that intend to issue both a Real ID compliant card and a non-compliant driver's license or ID card. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about compliance and extensions. So the extensions allow the states additional time to comply with the Act. So the Act itself authorizes the Secretary to grant extensions of time, so this is within the discretion of the Secretary, so long as the state provides adequate justification for noncompliance. Now, we do this in a couple different ways. Normally, we try to provide an annual extension, so every October 10th is when the extension normally expires, and states that have an extension and need an additional extension have that opportunity to provide an update to us regarding how they're meeting those 43 Real ID requirements, and then we could review it. And again, if it looks like they're making sufficient progress, we're likely to go ahead and grant another one-year extension through that next October. Now, some states had particular issues, particularly with some of the states having legislative barriers to tackle, meaning they had an anti-Real ID Act on the books that they needed to overcome or something in that regard. So for states in that situation, what we did this year was provided limited extensions. Now, those extensions are all expiring June 6th of this year. And so for the states that have those limited extensions before June 6th, they have to be able to come back to DHS and show what progress they've been able to make in removing those legislative barriers. Also, we're looking for them then to fully state that they intend to comply with all 43 requirements. Then the last thing we've done in the past is provide no extension. So if the state is not committed to meeting all Real ID requirements, not being able to make progress, then in those few instances and circumstances, that state was not granted an extension. Now, as I move to the next slide, we can see the current status of all the states. So as of right now, there's just 4 states that don't have extensions: Montana, Minnesota, Missouri, and Maine. But we do have a lot of states that either have a full extension expiring in October or a limited extension expiring in June. And we also have the best news of all, 26 states that are fully compliant. Those are the ones that are in green. So I'd like to now move on into our phase enforcement plan. So phase enforcement has begun since 2014. The Secretary of Homeland Security in January 2016 issued this updated phased milestone enforcement timeline. So it started with DHS headquarters in 14, then it moved on to facilities with lower levels of security required, moved up to the different security levels, and then you can see where we are now is it's in place for all federal buildings, but in January 22nd of 2018, then it'll apply to boarding commercial aircraft or accessing the security area of an airport, and so that's going to be managed by TSA. So TSA has begun notifications. In December this past year, they put out signage at all airports as well as bookmarks that they handed out to passengers. And then you could see the January 2018 deadline is what we call state-based. So what that means is either a state must be compliant or the state must have an extension. If the state has an extension, then any of the currently issued documents by that state will be acceptable by TSA. I think that's important to mention. However, when we get to 2020, October 1st, then it's passengers from all states without compliant documents. That's what we call card-based enforcement. That means that the citizens need to actually have Real ID compliant cards that have been issued by the states. Now, TSA will also accept certain alternative IDs, like passports, military IDs. There's a fairly long list of alternative documents on their website, and we try to point people toward that because they may already have one of these other acceptable documents for boarding airplanes. Moving to the next slide. So Real ID enforcement only applies to state-issued licenses and identification cards, again for the 3 official purposes that I've already mentioned. Now, Real ID enforcement does not impact access control checkpoints where the individual are generally not even required to present an identification document. So one of the things we made clear to the federal agencies is we're not telling them to begin asking for state IDs and driver's licenses if they didn't necessarily require that. So it could have been a type of building that had, free flow access of public citizens being able to go to different parts of the building to conduct their business. So we didn't ask them to change anything they're already doing in that regard. But it does prohibit the federal agencies from accepting, it does not, very important, does not prohibit federal agencies from accepting other forms of identification as alternatives. And so just as TSA accepts these alternative ID documents, so do all federal agency buildings. And so we have that list up on there's an information security guide, it's a best practice guide up on the DHS website. And so we have a full listing of all those documents as well. But they're pretty much the same documents that TSA is accepting. So things like passport, U.S. passport card, U.S. military ID, permanent resident card, border crossing card, as well as enhanced driver's licenses. Now, real ID enforcement, we've asked the federal agencies to kind of go out of their way so that it would not negatively affect people who are needing access to federal agencies for safety and health or life-preserving services. So that could include veterans accessing VAs and hospitals and other health clinics on military bases, for example. Also, that we've asked them to go out of the way to find ways that would not interrupt people's participation in constitutionally protected activities, including voting or, say, coming to a courthouse for jury duty, as well as applying for or receiving federal benefits. Now, ways federal agencies will work that is they still can't accept a non-real ID compliant ID from a state without an extension, but they can provide other options for access, such as providing an escort or putting someone on a visitor list. They can do a pre-authentication before the person gets there, that type of thing. And my last slide, just to show you the initial versus final phases of aviation enforcement, and that's just kind of bring home that in January 22nd, 2018, it's state-based enforcement. So long as, preferably the state's already compliant, but if the state has an extension, then we will be accepting the driver's licenses and IDs that are issued by that state. However, when we get to 2020, that's when all cards themselves, all driver's licenses and IDs, actually have to be Real ID compliant. Okay, at this time, I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Steve. Very informative, and as you just indicated, we would like to shift gears to today's Q&A portion. So just as a reminder for everyone joining us, please feel free to type any questions that you have in the chat box in the lower left-hand corner. I did receive a couple questions ahead of time from folks that weren't able to join, so I'll throw a couple out there at first and give folks maybe a minute or two to ask their own. So the first one, and I got this a couple different times, and you touched on it towards the end, so I apologize because some of this might be repetitive of what you just talked about. But in general, for residents from non-compliant states, I know you talked about possible options to obtain an ID that would be acceptable, and maybe a second part of that, and this may not be something that you can answer, but I'll throw it out there anyway. Does DHS or the State Department, as you talked about passports, are they considering any options to provide cost reductions for low-income residents for federally issued IDs?
Okay, so I'll try to answer the first one. I think you're asking, so if it's a non-compliant state with an extension, then they're able to use their existing driver's license and identification cards to access federal buildings right now, and that will not change in the near future. Of course, if it's a non-compliant state without an extension, then they're undergoing enforcement as of right now, and are not able to use non-real ID compliant driver's license and IDs to access federal buildings. And that would continue for them with TSA enforcement in January.
Okay, and I guess, maybe for those, and I'm sorry if I missed this.
No, go ahead.
Is, Department of State, or for those IDs that are issued by DHS, is there a consideration for residents in non-compliant states to provide, especially for low-income residents, to providing them at reduced or no cost?
So the Department of State already does have a lower price card. It's called U.S. Passport card. It is cheaper than a U.S. passport. So they already make that available today. We've also reached out to the Department of State to make sure they'd be aware of an increased amount of applications for both passports and passport cards.
Great. And then second question that I got a couple different times, obviously with a fairly new DHS Secretary Kelly, has there been discussion with regards to flexibility of the implementation dates, specifically to Phase 4?
So we did brief the Secretary, actually just briefed him last Friday, and the Secretary has made it very clear that Real ID is the law. He intends to fully implement it. He has seen the phase enforcement schedule, and he has fully endorsed that schedule. So at this time, there is no changes to the schedule envisioned.
Great. And kind of turning to some of the questions, and you may be able to see them yourself, Steve, in the chat box from Brandon, assuming from Oregon, talks about compact or free association and kind of how that relates to Real ID.
I might need a little more information about that in terms of compact or free association.
Not a problem. Brandon, if you're on the phone, I will connect you offline after the webinar with Steve.
Great.
I was going to make sure that question gets answered.
Yeah, I'd be happy to get an answer for that. Thank you.
Next question talks, and you may be able to see this yourself, compliant ID requires a U.S. address. Can U.S. residents residing abroad, for those not in the military, maintain a U.S. driver's license compliant ID?
Can you say that one more time, please?
Sure. So, a compliant ID requires does require a U.S. address, and can U.S. residents residing abroad maintain a U.S. driver's license or compliant ID?
I'll have to get back to them with that question.
Okay.
Do we have the name of the person, the contact information of the person who asked it?
Yes, we have that, and we can do that offline.
Okay, thank you.
And this is maybe a general question, and you did touch on it slightly earlier. In general, and this may be difficult to generalize, but do licenses from the compliant states contain more information as compared to, say, licenses from those states with extensions and those non-compliant states?
I don't believe the driver's licenses themselves have any more information on them. I think it's more about the information that has to be verified to properly identify the person receiving it.
Okay. Our next question, which I'm going to assume from Wanda from Missouri, asks about what a state such as Missouri, which, as you noted earlier, I believe on slide 7, is a non-compliant state. What can they do to get another extension for its citizens? And I realize that may be a question you need to kind of speak offline about.
But what I can say, though, is for the 4 states that are non-compliant without extensions, they all have Anti-Real ID Act legislation on their state books, and they need to repeal that legislation in order so that they can fully commit to complying with Real ID. In fact, I believe all 4 have been making progress in that regard.
Great. This next question may be a little bit in the weeds, but can you speak to the security requirements related to the location of collection of personally identifiable information? In the case of a state that produces the actual cards centrally, is there a lower physical IT security standards if the cards aren't actually present where the personally identifying information is collected?
So the security standards would apply to, I think, wherever the information is being collected and stored. It would apply equally. And same thing if they had other offices that actually issued driver's licenses. The same security standards would be required in terms of physical security, in terms of background checks for employees, all those things.
Great. this next question is one I got in a slightly different form as well from another legislator beforehand. But Debbie asks, how will confusion at airports be minimized as states will be in various stages of compliance? And I know you talked about kind of TSA signage, and bookmarks, but I guess maybe as we get closer to January 2018, obviously, there's the potential to impact a significant number of residents in, at least 4 states at this point, and obviously the potential to go up or down.
Right. So I guess there's 2 things we're doing. There's both internal outreach and external outreach. So internally, we're working very closely, first of all, with all federal agencies. So we have a direct line to them. We continually update them on the progress. We have send them email notifications. We have conference calls, things like that, to make sure that they're fully up to speed on what's going on. And as well as if ever issues come up, we're in direct contact with those federal agencies to resolve them. Regarding TSA, we're probably even in closer contact with them. We're literally working with them on a daily basis, and everything we do, we work very closely with TSA, so they're aware exactly of all the rollouts, of any decisions being made, and then we're constantly in contact with them to make sure we understand how they're rolling out, how they're going to be enforcing it in January. And we've been working very closely together. You're going to see this very soon as a broader public engagement strategy. And so there's going to be a lot of additional outreach coming. It's already started, and you're going to see much more of it in the months to come.
Great. Next question, I apologize for missing it at the top. I'm pretty sure it's currently required, but by what date will you need a compliant license to access a military base?
So you're saying when we reach October 1st, 2020 is when we go to full card-based compliance.
And this, and I don't want to change slides here, but I believe it was slide maybe 7 or 8 that had the enforcement dates for all the different phases.
Right. So noted. So enforcement is already pre-existing or in place for all federal agencies for all phases except for the last one for TSA. And so again, it's down to if the state is non-compliant without an extension, then they're not going to be able to use their state-issued driver's license to access it. However, if they have an extension, then they are able to use their state-issued driver's license or ID to access that facility.
Great. And in general, is there an age requirement for a compliant ID?
It's no different than the age requirement that the states place for issuing IDs and driver's licenses. There's no change by the federal act.
And again, you touched on this earlier with regards to the schedule for extensions as tends to be the October to October timeline.
Yeah.
Obviously, with a significant impact on state residents, if a state with a current extension or a state currently receiving an extension loses that extension for 2018, are there plans to change kind of the announcement schedule for 2018 extensions given the January 22nd date?
So for those who are currently under an extension expiring this October 10th, so if for some reason they were not granted a continued extension, they would be given a grace period of several months before enforcement would begin. And that would give the state the opportunity both for the governor's office to let the state residents know anything they need to do in order to get an alternative license, say as a passport, and otherwise to prepare or to come into compliance. We could take a compliance application right up until the last day. And so we have not set that specific date, but more than likely it would be January 22nd when that grace period would end for anyone who lost their extension.
Great. And I realize this is maybe the third time you've gotten a version of this question, but outside of TSA and their public awareness campaigns at airports, can you offer any further specifics with regards to kind of DHS's public awareness surrounding Real ID and its potential implications for impacting air travel?
Are you asking what additional things we'll be doing to communicate the message?
Yes.
So you're going to see things in letters to the editor. You're going to see announcements in newspapers. We're going to be doing a lot of additional interviews and a lot of additional speaking engagements like this one. So we're looking for every opportunity, actually, to make sure the public is fully informed. The last thing we want is a resident to be caught off guard, to show up at the airport and not know what the situation was for their state and for them to be able to use their driver's license to board an aircraft.
Great. And this next question I realize might be a bit out there, but in general, I mean, thankfully this has not happened to myself, but I have heard stories where someone going on vacation or visiting a family member in a different state who is using air travel to get there and back misplaces their state-issued ID, but still obviously has to travel back. I imagine there are there are policies in place to allow that person to travel back on their return ticket, and would those apply once, I guess, the first part of Phase 4 goes into effect? And I hope that question made sense.
No, I think I understand. So exactly. So TSA does have procedures in place now to handle that situation where, say, you're going to travel with your passport or something and you forget it that day or something. They'll establish that you actually do have a valid passport, and then they'll make accommodations. They have procedures so they can still verify that you are who you say you are. Now, when we get to the Real ID enforcement, there's a couple of things. One is if the person is traveling from again a state that's non-compliant without an extension, then we're not going to make that service available to that person. I mean, that's going to be important for enforcing the law. However, if the person is using alternative documents, say their passport, then I believe TSA will make sure arrangements are in place to be able to take care of that type of situation, which we'd expect to be, not very often.
Great. The final question that I have right now, and you touched on this a little bit earlier with regards to grants for states, but I guess with a new secretary on board, obviously the president's full budget for fiscal year 2018 expected sometime next month. Is the department considering additional grants to states specific to Real ID implementation to help cover some of the significant costs in certain cases related to Real ID implementation?
So in terms of current grants that are available, what we'd expect going forward is this Homeland Security grants that are already being issued to the states.
Thanks. And real quick, I'll just put out, if there are any additional questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. And if I missed any that had been asked, I first off apologize for missing them, but if maybe you could just retype them. And then, Steve, while I'm giving folks a final chance, can you generally categorize the reasons that states, are not in compliance, or is that really kind of a state-specific issue?
Well, aside from the most of the limited extension states, we actually have, state regulation, state legislation preventing them from coming into compliance. For most of the states that have extensions, as you can understand, it's often a significant effort to make the changes to hardware, software, processes. Oftentimes, it's not just the DMV system that's being updated, but the larger state systems themselves. And so often they may be part of a larger modernization effort. And those things take time and oftentimes multi-year funding. And so we understand that. And so long as they provide a plan with those milestones, that's usually the normal reason why states are getting extensions. They're fully committed and they're putting the things in place. So they just need more time to fully execute everything. Great.
Well, I guess maybe since I don't see any additional questions, I will just note that, as I change the slides here, if anyone participating in today's call thinks of an additional question or a concern today, tomorrow, next week, feel free to send me an email. Steve, want to thank you and obviously many members of DHS's intergovernmental staff. They have been extremely helpful in responding to and getting answers to specific questions from states, or even when the situation warrants working one-on-one. So we definitely do appreciate that from NCSL's perspective. So definitely thank you for that. And really, I would just like to kind of extend a final thank you to you, Steve, for joining us today, and thank you to all of our attendees for participating in today's webinar. As a reminder, a recording of today's webinar and the presentation slides will be made available shortly. As I mentioned earlier, our next webinar will be in 2 weeks, focusing on state efforts to fight food waste. To register or find out more information, please visit ncsl.org or just send me a quick email. And I know that there were a couple folks that or questions that required kind of offline communication, so if those folks are still on the line, I will be sending kind of an email introduction later today or Monday, so please be on the lookout for that. So again, thank you to everyone who joined us today for your continued interest and support of NCSL. Have a great weekend, and we hope to see you for the rest of the 2017 Spring Webinar Series. Have a great weekend, guys.